There is something about the English countryside in summer that makes you feel like nothing terrible could ever happen there. The hedgerows sit fat and green along the roadsides, ancient and unhurried. The light falls long and golden across open fields in a way that feels almost painted. The roads wind through villages where the stone is the color of warm honey, and the air smells of grass and something older than memory. It is the kind of landscape that feels safe in a way that cities never quite manage, a place where the world seems slower and more ordered and somehow more human. It is also, underneath all of that beauty, a place where people have disappeared. There is something that investigators who work cold cases will tell you, and it is this: the most dangerous places are never the ones that look dangerous. The alleyways and the dark streets, those are the places where people are alert, where instincts are sharp and senses are tuned. The truly dangerous places are the ones that disarm you. The ones that make you lower your guard because everything around you is telling you that you are safe. An open road. A lady on a warm afternoon. A car that stops and a driver who smiles and says they are heading your way. This is about what happens when freedom and danger occupy the same space. It is about the kind of trust that young people extend when they are out in the world for the first time, making their own way, believing in the fundamental goodness of strangers, because most strangers are good, most of the time, and that is what makes the exception so devastating. It is about a young woman who came to England to see something of the world before the serious business of her life began. Who carried a rucksack on her back and a diary in her bag and a head full of the kind of curiosity and independence that some people have and others can only admire. Who stood on the side of a road in August 1983 with her thumb raised and the whole English countryside stretched ahead of her, and who trusted the world enough to let a stranger decide where her day would go. It is about what was taken from her, and what was hidden, and what was torn away so that no one would ever know the name of the person who did it. And it is about the fact that 4 decades later, that name is still missing. This is Eila's story. Before we go any further, what device are you watching this on right now? Phone under the covers. Tablet on the couch. Desktop with headphones on so nobody knows what you're listening to. Drop your location and your setup in the comments, I read every single one of them. And if you are here for gripping, detailed true crime stories like this one, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Because this story is one that gets darker before it makes any sense, and you are going to want to be here for all of it. Eila Karjalainen was born in Finland, a country that shapes its people in particular ways. Finland is a nation built on a culture of resilience and self-reliance, of long winters that require a certain inner fortitude, and short, luminous summers that its people greet with a kind of fierce gratitude. It is a nation that produces, by and large, people who are practical and capable and quietly determined, people who do not make a fuss about difficulty, who face the world on its own terms, and who get things done. Eila was 23 years old in the summer of 1983. She had grown up in Helsinki and had pursued nursing as her profession, not just any nursing, but mental health nursing, a field that requires a particular kind of empathy, a capacity for sitting with people in their pain without flinching away. She was, by all accounts, an adventurous and independent young woman. The kind of person who had plans and pursued them, who was curious about the world beyond the horizon of what she already knew. She had arranged to start a course in mental health nursing later that year. But before that course began, she gave herself a gift, a 2-week holiday in England. A chance to see the country, to move through its landscape, to meet its people, to experience something new before the structure of professional training closed back in around her. She was the kind of traveler who kept a diary. Not a private journal locked away from the world, but a record of the people she encountered, names, places, the small details of encounters that would otherwise dissolve into the general memory of a journey. She wrote down the names of people who gave her rides, people she stayed near, people she spoke to along the way. It was a habit that spoke to a particular kind of personality, someone who believed that the strangers she met were worth remembering. Someone who moved through the world with enough generosity of spirit to think that the name of a person who drove her 30 miles down a road on a warm Tuesday was worth writing down. That habit, that small, thoughtful, human habit, would become one of the most important details in a murder investigation that would confound detectives for decades. Eila arrived in the United Kingdom on the 2nd of August 1983, coming into the country through the port at Harwich on the east coast of England. She had planned her route the way young backpackers do, loosely, with enough structure to have a direction and enough freedom to change it. She had most likely spent time in London first, as so many visitors do, taking in the landmarks and the energy of the capital, adding names to her diary, absorbing the strangeness and familiarity of a country that speaks a language she had learned but had never quite lived in before. By early August, she had moved west. She was staying at Shaw's Field Farm on Chinner Hill in Oxfordshire, a rural base from which she could continue her exploration of the English countryside. Chinner Hill sits in an area of quiet, rolling beauty, the kind of Oxfordshire landscape that has barely changed in a century. The kind of place where a young Finnish woman with a rucksack on her back would have felt entirely at peace. Hitchhiking, in 1983, was not the suspicious and marginal activity it would come to seem in later decades. It was simply how a significant portion of young people got around when they were traveling on limited budgets. Students did it routinely. Backpackers did it as a matter of course. The practice had a long and accepted social history in Britain, and while it was not without risk, it had never been entirely without risk. It was considered by most people who did it to be a perfectly reasonable way to travel. The risks were known to exist in the abstract, in the way that all risks exist in the abstract for people who are young and energetic and believe, as young people generally do, that the worst outcomes happen to other people. On the morning of the 7th of August 1983, Eila Karjalainen set out from her base on Chinner Hill heading west on the A40 in the direction of Oxford. She had her rucksack with her. She had her diary. She had her passport and her travel documents and the small accumulation of belongings that a careful traveler carries. She was due to fly home to Helsinki on August the 14th, a week away. One more week of England. One more week of new names in the diary. She was last seen alive on the A40 that morning, thumb raised, heading toward Oxford. She never arrived. When the 14th of August came and passed without Eila returning to Helsinki, her family raised the alarm. A missing persons report was filed. The investigation that followed produced, initially, almost nothing. There were no immediate witnesses who could confirm what had happened on that road. There were no phone records to trace. This was 1983, a decade and a half before mobile phones would change the way people could be tracked and found. There was no CCTV footage from the rural A40. There was a young woman who had been on a road, and then there was nothing. The weeks passed. August became September. September became October. October became November. And on November the 25th, 1983, a dog walker, or, in some accounts, a person exploring the woodland, came across something in the dense undergrowth of Kingswood on the Blenheim estate near Woodstock in Oxfordshire. The woodland there is thick and dark even in autumn, the kind of place where the light never fully reaches the ground. The kind of place where something could lie undiscovered for a very long time. What they found had been lying there for 3 months. The remains were in an advanced state of decomposition. There was no identification on the body, and nothing near it that immediately confirmed who this person had been. The investigation would take several more weeks to determine that the woman in Kingswood was Eila Karjalainen, 23 years old, from Helsinki, Finland. And here is where the story takes its first dark turn, because the discovery of her body did not bring clarity. It only deepened the mystery. Because 2 weeks after her remains were identified, something else was found. 7 miles away. On a levee off the A40 between Oxford and Witney, near a place called Barnard Gate. Her rucksack. And what was inside that rucksack, and what was missing from it, would haunt this investigation for the next 4 decades. Think about what it means that the rucksack was found separately from the body. Think about what it tells you about the person who left it there. If Eila had died as the result of an accident, if there had been any possibility that this was something other than what the evidence eventually confirmed, then the rucksack would not have been separated from her. The two things would have been found together, in the same place, part of the same terrible scene. But they were not. They were 7 miles apart. The body was in the deep undergrowth of Kingswood on the Blenheim estate. The rucksack was in a levee on the A40. Someone had made a decision about where each of them would end up. Someone had driven or walked with that rucksack, kept it for a period of time, and then placed it in a levee 7 miles from where Eila's body had been left in the woodland. The rucksack was found 3 weeks after her remains were discovered. Which means that whoever had it held onto it for roughly 3 months after Eila died, then disposed of it 2 weeks before Christmas, 1983. The timing of that disposal is something investigators would return to repeatedly. Was it panic, triggered by the news coverage of the body being found? Was it calculation, a deliberate decision to throw police off the track, to create confusion about geography and timeline? Or was it something else entirely? Inside the rucksack were Eila's passport, her travel documents, and her personal effects. Those were intact. They had been kept, seemingly undisturbed, for 3 months. A killer who had gone through her belongings and taken anything of value would have left the bag behind immediately, but the bag was kept. A killer who was simply disposing of evidence would have destroyed it or buried it somewhere far from any road. Instead, it was placed in a public levee where it would be found. That choice was deliberate. The decision to leave it where it would be discovered, rather than where it would remain hidden, has the texture of communication rather than concealment. And then there was the diary. Eila had been the kind of traveler who wrote down the names of people she met. She had been doing it throughout her trip. But when the diary was found inside the rucksack, several pages had been torn out. Not damaged, not worn, not accidentally lost. Torn. Deliberately removed. Gone. The question that immediately presents itself, and that has never been answered, is, who tore them out? Was it Eila herself, in some moment before her death that the evidence cannot reconstruct? Or was it the person who had her rucksack for 3 months, the same person, almost certainly, who killed her? And if the pages were torn out by whoever killed her, what was on those pages? Eila wrote down names. She wrote down the names of people she met on her journey. If she had kept to her habit throughout her final days of travel, then the pages immediately preceding the last entry in her diary would have contained the names of people she encountered on or around the 7th of August 1983. The day she disappeared. The people who crossed her path in those final hours. The name of her killer may have been written in that diary. And someone tore those pages out. The forensic work done on the rucksack and its contents was as thorough as 1983 technology allowed. Fingerprints were lifted from the backpack itself, from tickets and travel documents found inside, from the surfaces of Eila's belongings. The prints were recorded and processed. But fingerprint databases in 1983 were not what they would become. Digital fingerprint matching did not yet exist in the form we know it today. The comparison was manual, laborious, and limited to the prints already in the system. The fingerprints found on Eila's belongings did not match anyone on record. They remain unidentified to this day. There was, of course, a post-mortem examination conducted once the remains were identified. The state of decomposition after 3 months in Woodland made a full forensic reconstruction difficult, but pathologists were able to determine the cause of death. Eila Karjalainen had been strangled. She had been killed manually, by someone who had used their hands to end her life. The violence of strangulation is not incidental or accidental, it is deeply, intimately personal. It requires physical proximity, sustained force, and the presence of the killer in close contact with the victim for the duration of the act. It is, of all the methods by which people are murdered, one of the most direct and most deliberate. This was not a crime that happened at a distance. Whoever killed Eila was close to her, was in physical contact with her, and chose to remain so until the end. The investigation that followed was hampered from the very beginning by the specific circumstances of the case. Eila was a foreign national, Finnish, with no family in the UK, no established network of acquaintances who could be interviewed, no workplace or social circle that police could map and investigate. She had been in the country for barely 5 days when she was killed. Every person who knew her in England was, by definition, a stranger she had met recently, someone she might have written down in her diary, if they hadn't torn the pages out. The international dimension added logistical complexity. Communication between British and Finnish investigators required coordination that was slower and more cumbersome in 1983 than it would be today. The information flow was not seamless. And in England, Eila was largely unknown. She had no face that the general public recognized, no story that the media could anchor to anything familiar. She was a Finnish visitor whose name most people in Oxfordshire had never heard before her murder, and the coverage of her case, while it existed, was not the kind of sustained public attention that sometimes breaks cold cases open. Her murder was featured on Crime Watch, the BBC's crime investigation program, in July 1984, almost a year after her death. The appeal asked anyone with information about Eila's movements on August 7, 1983, to come forward. The appeal generated leads, some of which were followed, none of which led to an arrest. The case was reopened in 1987. The reason for the reopening is significant. In 1987, detectives investigating the murder of a 17-year-old girl named Rachel Partridge found a detail that connected the two cases in a way that made them sit up very straight. Rachel Partridge had been murdered after attempting to hitch a lift, and her destination had been Shaw's Field Farm on Chinner Hill. The same place where Eila Karjalainen had been staying. Two young women, both connected to the same location on Chinner Hill, both hitchhiking in Oxfordshire, both murdered. The detectives working the Partridge case examined whether there were links to Eila's death. No clear links were formally proven. But the coincidence, if it was a coincidence, is one that investigators have never quite been able to dismiss. Two women. The same place. The same road. The same method of travel. 4 years apart. There is a name that comes up whenever people discuss this case in depth. A name that has become attached to the mystery of Eila Karjalainen's murder through a combination of geography, method, and the kind of pattern recognition that investigators and true crime researchers engage in when they are looking at unsolved cases and known killers side by side. That name is Christopher Halliwell. And to understand why that name keeps surfacing, and why it is so difficult to either confirm or dismiss, you need to understand who Christopher Halliwell was, and what he became, and what he said about himself in the years before anyone knew his name. In the mid-1980s, Christopher Halliwell was a young man in his early 20s living in the Swindon area of Wiltshire. He had come to the attention of police not for violence but for burglary. He was convicted of breaking and entering and sentenced to a period in prison at HMP Dartmoor. It was during this incarceration, in approximately 1985, that Halliwell made a statement to a fellow prisoner, a cellmate named Ernest Springer, that would later take on terrible significance. According to Springer, Halliwell told him that he had had sexual contact with a woman while strangling her. And then, and this is the detail that would later echo through every investigation into Halliwell's possible crimes, he asked Springer how many women he would have to kill to be considered a serial killer. He was asking the question the way someone asks a question about a thing they are seriously considering. Not theoretically. Not as a hypothetical. As a genuine inquiry into a future he was contemplating. He was, at most, 21 years old. Christopher Halliwell was born in 1965. That means that in August 1983, when Eila Karjalainen was hitchhiking along the A40 in Oxfordshire and was murdered on or around the 7th of that month, Halliwell was 18 years old. He was not yet 20. He was not, at that point, the taxi driver he would later become, the cover that would allow him, decades on, to cruise the streets of Swindon at night picking up vulnerable young women without arousing suspicion. In 1983 he was a teenager. That fact is where every discussion of the Halliwell theory must begin. Because it is the fact that most complicates the connection, and the fact that defenders of the theory have to account for before anything else can be argued. 18 years old. No confirmed violent crimes on record at that age. No arrest, no conviction, no documented incident that places him at or near the A40 in Oxfordshire on August 7, 1983. There is no forensic evidence that has ever been presented publicly connecting him to Eila's death. No DNA. No fingerprints. No witness placing him at the scene. In purely evidential terms, Halliwell's connection to this case is speculation, informed speculation, the kind that arises when investigators look at patterns and geographies and methods and ask uncomfortable questions, but speculation nonetheless. And yet the theory does not dissolve under scrutiny. It persists. Here is why. What the investigators who came after Halliwell's 2011 arrest found, when they began examining his history in depth, was that the gap between his known crimes was baffling in a way that almost nothing else about serial killers tends to be. Halliwell is confirmed to have killed Becky Godden-Edwards in 2003. He is confirmed to have killed Sian O'Callaghan in 2011. 8 years separated those two confirmed murders. Senior Investigating Officer Detective Sergeant Sean Memory, speaking publicly after Halliwell's sentencing, said openly that he could not understand how a person could kill as Halliwell killed and then have an 8-year gap before killing again. He said he was definitely concerned that there were other victims in that gap, and quite possibly before it. Then there is the matter of what Halliwell said to his cellmate in 1985, 2 years after Eila's murder. He described having sexual contact with a woman while strangling her. He asked how many women he would have to kill to be a serial killer. This was not reported to police at the time. Springer kept it to himself. It only emerged later, in the investigation following Halliwell's arrest in 2011, as part of the detailed examination of his history that investigators conducted when they realized they might be dealing with a man who had been killing for much longer than they knew. There is also the matter of geography. Halliwell spent much of his life in the west of England, Swindon primarily, but Wiltshire, Oxfordshire, Gloucestershire, all fell within his operational territory. The Blenheim Estate, Kingswood, the A40, the laybys near Barnard Gate, these are not, geographically, distant from the world that Halliwell moved through. When Sion O'Callaghan's body was found, it was near Uffington in Oxfordshire. Becky Godden-Edwards was found in Gloucestershire. The pattern of disposal, bodies in rural outdoor locations, the use of woodland and countryside, is consistent across Halliwell's confirmed crimes and consistent with what happened to Eila. And there is the method. Eila was strangled. Halliwell's confirmed method, and his earlier self-described method, the one he described to Springer, involved strangulation. He told his cellmate he had had physical contact with a woman while strangling her. In 1985. The year Eila's murder had just faded from active investigation. None of this is evidence. It needs to be said clearly and kept clearly in view, none of this constitutes evidence. Halliwell has never been charged with Eila's murder. Police have never publicly named him as a suspect in her case. The connection between him and the young Finnish woman who died on the A40 in 1983 exists only in the realm of theory, comparison, and the kind of unsatisfied professional concern that experienced investigators carry when they believe they know more than they can prove. But there is something else to consider, and it is the fact that police recovered, from a pond near the area of Sion O'Callaghan's death, a cache of approximately 60 items of women's clothing and accessories. 60 items. 2 women were confirmed victims. 60 sets of material, items that investigators believe were trophies, kept and hoarded by Halliwell from his victims. The majority of those items have never been identified. They have not been linked to any known victim. They belong to someone, or to multiple someones, whose fate is not yet accounted for. Former Detective Superintendent Steve Fulcher, who led the investigation that caught Halliwell and who has since written about the case at length, stated his belief that if those items represent what he suspects they represent, then Halliwell may have been killing as often as once or twice a year across his adult life. If that is true, if Halliwell began killing at or around the age when he told his cellmate what he told him, then the mathematics of that pattern would begin somewhere in the early to mid-1980s. August 1983 is squarely inside that window. The theory is not evidence. It may never be provable. But it is not reckless, and it is not the kind of speculation that serious investigators wave away. It is the kind of open question that sits at the center of an unsolved murder and refuses to leave. And yet even if Halliwell is eliminated from consideration entirely, even if the theory is wrong, the mystery of who killed Eila Karjalainen does not become simpler. It becomes, if anything, more diffuse, because then the killer is someone who has never surfaced. Someone who has left no trace in any database that has been checked in 40 years. Someone who tore the pages from a diary and drove away and simply disappeared into an ordinary life. Let's go back to the A40. Let's stand on that road in August 1983 and think about what Eila would have seen. The A40 in Oxfordshire is not a motorway, it is a main road, a proper old road, the kind that connects towns and passes through villages and has laybys where drivers can stop and where hitchhikers can wait. In 1983 it carried significant traffic, lorries heading west toward Whitney and beyond, cars going to Oxford, commercial vehicles passing through. The road was busy enough that a young woman with a raised thumb would not have waited long for a ride. Someone would have stopped. Someone did stop. The psychology of what happens when a car stops for a hitchhiker is worth dwelling on for a moment. By the time the car stops, a negotiation has already occurred, the driver has assessed the person on the side of the road and decided they are someone worth stopping for. The hitchhiker, in turn, approaches the car, looks at the driver, makes their own rapid assessment. In 1983, before the culture of fear around hitchhiking had fully solidified, that assessment was often weighted heavily toward trust. Most people who stopped were fine. Most rides were uneventful. The mental algorithm that Eila would have run through when a car stopped for her on the A40 was calibrated by experience and cultural norms that favored trust. She got in. She had her rucksack and her diary and her week's worth of plans. She got into a car driven by someone whose name, in all likelihood, she would have written down. And then she stopped writing anything at all. The thing about an unsolved murder is that it never quite becomes the past. It exists, permanently, in a kind of suspended present, a moment that cannot be completed because the ending is missing. For the investigators who worked this case in 1983, and in 1987 when it was reopened, and in 2004 when a renewed appeal was made, and in the years since when the Halliwell connection began to be seriously examined, the case has always existed in this state of irresolution. It has never been closed. It has never been solved. It has only been paused. In 2004, Thames Valley Police made a renewed public appeal for information about Eila's murder. The appeal was made 21 years after her death, timed to coincide with the anniversary of the discovery of her body. Officers appealed for anyone who had been on the A40 in August 1983 and had seen or given a lift to a young Finnish woman to come forward. They specifically noted that forensic techniques had advanced significantly since 1983, and that fingerprints and other evidence preserved from the original investigation could now potentially be matched against the expanded databases. The appeal generated some responses. Whether those responses yielded anything substantial has never been publicly confirmed. No arrests followed. Then in 2011, something happened that sent investigators back to cold cases across the west of England with renewed urgency. Christopher Halliwell was arrested. And as the true scope of what he might have done began to emerge, the hidden cache of clothing, the gap between his confirmed murders, the statement to his cellmate in 1985, cases like Eila's began to be looked at again through a different lens. What investigators working the Halliwell case found was that his life history contained a remarkable degree of mobility and geographic spread for a man who appeared, on the surface, to be simply a taxi driver in Swindon. He had worked multiple jobs over the years that allowed him to move around. He had interests, fishing, narrowboat travel, that took him to rivers and rural locations across the English countryside. He was someone who spent significant amounts of time in open countryside, alone, in places where the presence of a solitary man would attract no particular attention. The Blenheim estate. The woodland in which Eila's body was found. These places are not somewhere you stumble into accidentally. Kingswood is deep, dense, and not particularly close to any main road. To leave a body there, to know that it would not be found quickly, to know the territory well enough to use it that way, required either local knowledge or the kind of exploration of the countryside that someone with an interest in fishing and rural locations might routinely engage in. This is the texture of the Halliwell theory when you examine it closely. It is not a neat argument. It does not produce a line from A to B to C with clean evidence at each step. It is, instead, a constellation of consistencies, geography, method, behavior, timing, the statement to the cellmate, that point in a direction without definitively confirming the destination. It is the kind of case that makes investigators frustrated because they can see the shape of something they cannot quite touch. There is another thread in this case that deserves serious attention, and it is the one that centers on what Eila's diary actually contained and what its absence means. We know she wrote down names. We know she was doing this throughout her trip. We know that the pages that were removed were, in all likelihood, among the most recent, the pages that recorded her encounters in the days around her death. The kind of person who tears pages from a diary found in a dead woman's rucksack is not operating randomly. That is a purposeful, thought-through act. You tear pages from a diary because you know that what is on those pages connects you to the woman who wrote them. You tear them out because your name is there. The implicit logic of that act is almost impossibly incriminating. Someone touched that diary. Someone went through the rucksack, which was not left at the scene but taken and held for 3 months, and read what was written there, and decided that certain pages could not be allowed to exist. And then, weeks later, that person drove to a lay-by on the A40 between Oxford and Witney and left the rucksack where it would be found. With the passport inside. With the personal belongings. With the diary, minus the pages they needed to disappear. Why leave the rucksack at all? That question is one that investigators have circled without resolution. If the goal was simply to eliminate evidence, the rucksack could have been burned, buried, thrown into the Thames. The decision to leave it in a public lay-by where it would certainly be found is strange. It suggests that whoever left it there wanted it found. Or that they were operating under the belief that leaving it there was somehow safer than any alternative. Or that there was something in the act of disposal that served a psychological function they needed, a closure of some kind, an ending, a line drawn. What is beyond argument is that whoever killed Eila Karjalainen was not a panicked opportunist who acted without thought. The 3 months of holding the rucksack. The decision about where to leave it. The removal of the diary pages. These are all deliberate acts, the actions of someone who was thinking clearly enough to manage evidence over an extended period of time. Someone who was, to whatever degree, organized. The forensic fingerprints taken from the rucksack and its contents are still, in theory, available. Modern digital fingerprint matching, and the dramatically expanded databases of the 21st century, mean that those prints could potentially be matched today in ways that were impossible in 1983 or even in 2004. The same is true, arguably even more so, for DNA evidence. Advances in genetic genealogy, the technique that has cracked cold cases decades old in the United States and is increasingly being used in the UK, mean that trace DNA evidence preserved from the original investigation might today be enough to construct a family tree, narrow a suspect pool, and potentially identify a killer. Whether such evidence has survived in usable form is not publicly known. Whether Thames Valley police have, in the years since Halliwell's arrest, pursued this line with the technology now available is not something that has been confirmed in the public record. What is known is that the case remains, officially, unsolved. Eila Karjalainen's killer has never been charged or arrested. No one has ever been formally named as a suspect. If you are watching this and you were on the A40 in August 1983, if you gave someone a lift that day, or if you saw a young woman with a rucksack on the roadside, or if you know something about what happened, the case is still open. The information is still relevant. It has never been too late. The investigation had one other significant dimension that is worth understanding in full. The discovery, in 1987, that Rachel Partridge had been murdered while hitchhiking toward Shaw's Field Farm, the same farm where Eila had been staying, was not treated as coincidental by detectives at the time. They looked at both cases together. They asked whether the same killer might have been operating in the same area, using the same method. They could not prove it. But the fact that they asked the question at all speaks to a professional instinct that the proximity of those two cases, in geography, in victim type, in method of travel, was not random. Shaw's Field Farm, Chinner Hill. A young Finnish nursing student on her way to Oxford. A 17-year-old girl on her way home. The same road. The same farm. Different years, but the same territory. Whatever happened on the A40 in August 1983 may have happened again. And the person responsible may have believed, correctly, that they had made themselves impossible to find. If you're still here with me on this, and I know this story is hitting hard right now, drop a comment below. Tell me what you think happened. I want to know your theory. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a really good time to do it, because what's coming next in this story gets significantly darker. Let us talk about what it means that no one was ever arrested. Not in 1983. Not in 1987. Not in 2004. Not after Halliwell's arrest in 2011, when investigators were turning over every stone in his history. Not in the years since. 40 years and no arrest. In a murder case, that is not simply an investigative failure, though it may partly be that. It is also, potentially, a reflection of how well the killer managed the aftermath of what they did. Managing the aftermath is the phrase criminologists use. It refers to the ability of a killer to return to ordinary life and remain there, to resume whatever routines they had before, to present whatever face to the world they had always presented, to avoid the tells and the changes in behavior that sometimes trip people up after they have done something irreversible. Most killers who are caught not because of brilliant forensic work but because something shifts. They talk to the wrong person. They change their behavior in a way that those close to them notice. They keep something they should not have kept. Whoever killed Eila did not appear to have done any of those things. They kept the rucksack for 3 months, which is in itself a significant act of retention, and then they disposed of it in a way that was controlled enough to avoid identification. They tore the relevant pages from the diary and kept them, or destroyed them. They left no DNA or fingerprint evidence that has ever been matched to anyone. They did not, as far as anyone can tell, confide in anyone who then came forward. They went back to their life, and their life closed over the event like water over a stone. This is the profile that emerges when you look at the facts. Not a panicked amateur, not someone who acted in the heat of a moment without any thought about what comes after. Someone who, whether through natural intelligence, prior experience, or simply the terrible luck that sometimes runs in a killer's favor, managed the hours and days and weeks after Eila's death with enough discipline to remain invisible for 40 years. The question of whether Eila was targeted or opportunistic is one that the available evidence cannot definitively answer. There are two broad possibilities. The first is that she was targeted in a general sense, that the killer was someone who was actively looking for hitchhikers, someone who regularly drove the A40 and watched for lone young women with their thumbs raised. Someone for whom the A40 was a hunting ground, whether or not they would have described it that way to themselves. The second possibility is that Eila encountered someone who was not, in any premeditated sense, planning to kill anyone that day, someone who gave her a lift with whatever they told themselves their intentions were, and who escalated to violence in a way that was, in the moment, driven by opportunity and impulse rather than advanced planning. The evidence from the aftermath, the careful management of the rucksack, the deliberate removal of the diary pages, the choice of Kingswood as a disposal site, tends to push away from the pure impulse theory. Pure impulse tends to produce messier aftertimes. The person who killed Eila seems, on the basis of what they did next, to have been someone who was capable of clear thought in the wake of extreme violence. Whether they arrived at the A40 intending violence, or whether the violence arrived uninvited and they then managed its consequences with unexpected competence, is something that cannot be determined from what is publicly known. What can be said is this: hitchhiking in the 1980s was not, for the majority of those who did it, dangerous. Millions of lifts were given and received without harm. The road was, for most people, exactly what it looked like, a way of getting from one place to another cheaply, with the added bonus of occasional human connection. The person who killed Eila exploited that context. They exploited the normalcy of the transaction, the established social script of a car stopping and a hitchhiker getting in. They used the machinery of a perfectly ordinary thing to do something that was the opposite of ordinary. The physical geography of what happened adds another layer of complexity. Kingswood on the Blenheim estate is not directly accessible from the A40. Getting there requires turning off the main road and navigating to the estate itself, which covers a considerable area around Woodstock. The woodland where Eila's body was found is deep within that estate, not visible from any road, not somewhere you would stumble across unless you either knew it or explored it deliberately. Whoever took Eila there knew where they were going, or at least knew the kind of territory they were navigating: rural, dense, far from eyes and ears. The A40 lay near Barnard Gate, where the rucksack was later found, is a different kind of location entirely. It is a standard roadside lay, the kind that any regular user of the A40 between Oxford and Witney would know. The choice to leave the rucksack there, on a road that Eila had been traveling when she was last seen, has a particular kind of audacity to it. The killer was not hiding the rucksack. They were placing it back in the landscape of the original crime, close enough to the circumstances of Eila's death that it would be found and connected to her missing persons case, while being far enough from Kingswood that the two locations would not immediately point to any specific person or route. That is not random behavior. That is someone thinking carefully about geography and sequence. The international dimension of the investigation, the fact that Eila was Finnish and had no established network in England, meant that a crucial category of potential witness was effectively unavailable. When detectives investigate a murder, they start with the victim's social world. They talk to the people who knew her: friends, colleagues, family members, romantic partners, neighbors. They map the victim's movements through testimony from people who were part of those movements. They look for inconsistencies in the stories people tell about their own whereabouts. For Eila, that social world, in England, barely existed. She had been in the country for 5 days. She had stayed at Shaw's Field Farm, and the people there could speak to what they had observed of her. She had passed through London, and whatever connections she made there were either recorded in her diary, or removed from it, or lost entirely. Her family in Finland knew her life there, her life before she arrived, her plans and her character and her relationships. But they could tell investigators very little about what had happened on the A40 on August the 7th, because they were not there. The investigation had no center of gravity. There was no network of friends to interview, no workplace to canvass, no regular haunts where people might remember her or remember who she was with. There was a body, a rucksack, a diary with pages torn out, and a set of fingerprints that matched nobody. And then there was her family, waiting in Helsinki. Think, for a moment, about what that was like for them. Eila left for England in early August. She was due back on the 14th. When she did not return, and when the missing persons investigation began and produced nothing, they were in a position that is almost impossible to imagine, knowing that something was wrong, unable to do anything about it from a distance, waiting for news from a country they may not have known well, about a daughter who had simply gone to see the world and had not come home. The weeks passed. The news, when it came, was the worst possible kind. Their daughter had been found. She had been in Woodland in Oxfordshire for 3 months. She had been strangled. And the person responsible had never been found. In the years that followed, Eila's family lived with a kind of grief that is specific to the families of murder victims whose cases go unsolved. It is not the clean, terrible grief of a loss that is understood and accounted for. It is grief with an open question at its center. Grief accompanied, perpetually, by not knowing. Not knowing who. Not knowing why. Not knowing whether, somewhere, that person was still alive and walking around and living a life that Eila was not allowed to live. If you are watching this and you have felt this story settle into you over the past few minutes, that feeling is the right response. This is a real person. This was a real life, cut off at 23 by someone whose name we do not know, in Woodland on an English estate on a day that should have been nothing more than another day in a 2-week holiday before a life of nursing began. There is a specific cruelty to the way this case fits into the broader landscape of violence against women in 1980s Britain that needs to be acknowledged directly. Eila Karjalainen was not the only young woman who died while hitchhiking in England during the decade. She was not the only young woman whose death was, in part, enabled by the normalcy that had grown up around the practice, the social acceptance of hitchhiking that made it feel like a reasonable risk when, for some women in some circumstances, it was not. The era had a specific texture of danger that was not entirely understood at the time, because the full picture of predatory violence against hitchhiking women was only assembled retrospectively, as individual cases were eventually solved and the patterns became visible. Peter Tobin, the Scottish serial killer convicted of 3 murders, was confirmed to have targeted at least one victim who had been hitchhiking. The 1995 murder of Céline Figard, a French student and backpacker in England, by a lorry driver, echoed Eila's case in multiple ways, a young European woman traveling alone in Britain, relying on the goodwill of strangers, killed by someone who was supposed to simply get her to the next place on her journey. The A40 itself, as a route, carries a particular weight in the history of roadside crime in the English Midlands and South. It is a long road that passes through countryside that is beautiful and, in the 1980s, largely unwatched. No cameras. No automated systems to record registration plates. No mobile phone signals to triangulate position. A car could travel the A40 in 1983 and, provided the occupants kept their behavior ordinary when visible to other drivers, be essentially invisible to anyone attempting to trace a route after the fact. What this means, practically, is that if someone picked up Eila on the A40 near London on the morning of August the 7th and drove her west, passing through the kind of rural Oxfordshire landscape that is genuinely beautiful, genuinely peaceful, genuinely disarming, there was almost no mechanism available in 1983 to establish, after the fact, anything about who the driver was or where they went. If no one saw them stop. If no one noted the registration. If the driver looked ordinary and drove ordinarily. Then they were nothing. They were invisible. This is the specific technological and social context that the killer exploited. Not deliberately, perhaps, or perhaps very deliberately, but exploited nonetheless. The 2004 appeal by Thames Valley Police was particularly significant in what it explicitly stated. Officers noted that advances in forensic technology since 1983 meant that evidence preserved from the original investigation could now potentially yield results that had been impossible at the time. They were referring to fingerprint database expansion, primarily, but also implicitly to the emerging potential of DNA analysis in cold cases. By 2004, DNA had already revolutionized criminal investigation, it had both convicted and exonerated people, and it had cracked cold cases that had seemed permanently unsolvable. The fingerprints found on Eila's rucksack and personal effects were in the system. The database against which they could be compared had grown enormously since 1983. No match was found. But absence of a match in a database is not the same as absence of a suspect. The database, even by 2004, was not comprehensive. There are people whose fingerprints are not on record. There are people who have never been arrested, never been processed through a system that would have captured their prints. If the killer was someone who had no prior convictions, or whose convictions predated the digital expansion of fingerprint records, they might not appear in any comparison, even today. The development of genetic genealogy, the technique that uses DNA from crime scenes to build family trees, identify relatives of an unknown suspect, and narrow the suspect pool through a combination of genetic science and traditional genealogical research, has been transformative in the United States in particular, where it has solved cold cases from the 1970s and 1980s with remarkable success. In the UK, the adoption of this technique has been slower, partly for legal reasons around privacy and the use of consumer genealogy databases. But the technology exists. The methodology exists. And cases from 1983, if biological material was collected and preserved with sufficient care, are within the potential reach of modern genetic investigation. Whether biological material exists in a usable form from the investigation of Eila's murder is not publicly confirmed. The condition of her remains, after 3 months in Woodland, would have made comprehensive biological collection challenging. But touch DNA, the kind left by a hand on a surface, by fingers on the cover of a rucksack, can survive in protected environments. The rucksack itself, which was handled by her killer, is the object of greatest potential evidentiary value. If it was preserved carefully after its discovery, and if the skin cells or biological material left by the person who carried and then discarded that rucksack have survived, then there exists a theoretical path to identification that did not exist in 1983. Theory is not evidence. Possibility is not certainty. But these are real possibilities. They exist in the space between what has been done and what might yet be done. In 2021, a book was published, The New Millennium Serial Killer, by former police intelligence officer Chris Clark and true crime podcast host Bethan Truman, that attempted to examine the full range of Christopher Halliwell's potential crimes. The book presented, alongside his confirmed murders, the cases of more than 20 women whose deaths and disappearances it argued were consistent with Halliwell's pattern. It did not, and could not, confirm Halliwell's involvement in any of those cases. But it gathered them into a documented record and presented the argument that the 2 confirmed murders were not the totality of what Halliwell had done. The book has a foreword by former Detective Superintendent Stephen Fulcher, the officer who caught Halliwell and who has spent years believing that the 2 known murders are the fraction visible above the waterline of something much larger. Fulcher's view, stated openly and repeatedly since Halliwell's sentencing, is that the cache of 60-plus items of women's clothing found near the crime scene represents trophies from multiple victims, not 2, not 5, but potentially many more. 60 items from 2 known victims is arithmetically implausible. 60 items from an unknown number of victims spanning a period from the early 1980s to 2011 is an entirely different proposition. Halliwell is currently serving a whole life order in prison. He has never cooperated with investigators beyond the initial confessions, which were themselves later ruled inadmissible due to the procedural failures of Detective Superintendent Fulcher, who broke pace regulations in his interrogation. Halliwell cannot be released. He has nothing, in a purely legal sense, to gain or lose from speaking about other crimes. And yet he has not spoken. He has maintained silence about what else he may have done. Whatever he knows about the 60-plus items in that cache, and whatever he knows about the women whose names may have been on the missing pages of a Finnish nurse's diary, he has kept to himself. That silence is itself a kind of answer. Or it is a very deliberate exercise of control by a man who has always used control as a weapon. Here is what we know. Here is what the record shows, stripped of theory and speculation, left only with fact. Eila Karjalainen arrived in England through the port at Harwich on August 2, 1983. She was 23 years old, a Finnish nursing student, preparing to begin a course in mental health nursing when she returned home. She had 2 weeks in England, and she intended to use them well. She traveled to London. She moved west. She stayed at Shaw's Field Farm on Chinner Hill in Oxfordshire. On the morning of August 7, 1983, she was on the A40 heading toward Oxford with her rucksack and her diary, her thumb raised, seeking a lift. She was last seen alive on that road on that morning. She was due to fly home on August the 14th. She did not make that flight. Her family raised the alarm. A missing persons investigation was launched. It produced nothing. On November the 25th, 1983, a person walking in Kingswood on the Blenheim estate in Woodstock, Oxfordshire, discovered human remains in dense undergrowth. The remains had been there for approximately 3 months. They were in an advanced state of decomposition. There was no identification on or near the body. It took several weeks of investigation to determine that the remains were those of Eila Karjalainen. She had been strangled. 2 weeks after her identification, a rucksack was found in a levee on the A40 near Barnard Gate, between Oxford and Witney. Inside were her passport and her personal belongings. Inside was also her diary, with several pages torn out. Fingerprints were taken from the rucksack and its contents. They were processed. No match was found. They have not been matched to any person since. The case was featured on Crime Watch in July 1984. A renewed appeal was made in 2004. The case was reopened in 1987 in connection with the murder of Rachel Partridge. No arrests have ever been made. No one has ever been formally named as a suspect. The case remains officially unsolved. Those are the facts. They are not enough. They have never been enough. What they leave behind is a space, a terrible, specific space, where the identity of a killer should be and is not. The fingerprints in the system that match no one. The diary pages that are gone. The name of a driver who stopped on the A40 on a warm August morning, who smiled in a way that seemed safe, who said they were heading in the right direction. Eila got into that car and did not get out alive. The person who drove that car, wherever they are now, if they are still alive, has lived for 40 years with what they did. They have watched news coverage, perhaps. They watched Crime Watch in July 1984, maybe, from the safety of their own living room. They read the 2004 appeal, possibly, and felt whatever they felt. They may have read about Christopher Halliwell's arrest in 2011 and felt the cold edge of proximity, of a name and a case getting close to something they needed to keep hidden. Or they may have felt nothing. Some people who commit these acts feel nothing thereafter. The violence was instrumental, it served a purpose in the moment, and when the moment passed, so did any emotional remainder. If that is the case here, then the killer has simply lived their life, in whatever form it took, untroubled by what they did in August 1983. That thought is almost harder to bear than the alternative. There is another angle to this case that deserves acknowledgement, and it is the one that has nothing to do with suspects or forensics or theories. It is the angle of absence. What Eila Karjalainen would have become if she had made it back to Helsinki on August the 14th. The mental health nursing course she was due to start. The career she would have built. The patients she would have sat with in the specific way that mental health nurses do, the patient, careful, human presence that the job demands. The relationships she would have had, the places she might have seen, the life that was waiting for her on the other side of a 2-week holiday that should have been nothing more than a wonderful adventure. 23 years old. Adventurous and independent and curious and thoughtful enough to write down the names of the people she met. Respectful enough of the humans she encountered to think they were worth remembering. That is who was on the A40 on August the 7th, 1983. Not a victim, not yet. A young woman in the middle of her life, with plans and a diary and a rucksack and the confidence of someone who had decided to go and see something of the world. What was taken from her was not simply her life, though it was that, and that is immeasurable. What was taken was also the possibility of her. The things she would have thought and done and felt and given to other people. The cumulative impact of a life fully lived. All of it removed, in one act, by one person, whose name is on torn pages that are missing from a diary. The investigation into this case is, officially, ongoing. Thames Valley police have not closed it. Cold cases of this nature, murders where the victim is deceased and the evidence is limited, are reviewed periodically as resources and technology allow. The fingerprints are on record. The case file exists. Every new development in forensic technology brings with it the theoretical possibility that something in the preserved evidence of August and November 1983 can be re-examined and can yield what 40 years of investigation have not yet produced. Genetic genealogy is the most significant of those technologies. It is not a guarantee. It requires biological material in usable condition, it requires the suspect's biological relatives to be present in genealogy databases, and it requires a significant investment of investigative resources. But it is a real tool. It has solved murders from the 1970s and 1980s. It has identified killers who believed, as the killer in this case may believe, that enough time and enough darkness have rendered them permanently safe. They are not permanently safe. The technology that was not available in 1983, in 1987, in 2004, exists now. It is advancing. The world that a killer from 1983 is hiding in is shrinking. For Eila's family, those who are still alive, those who have carried this for 4 decades, the possibility of an answer is not academic. It is everything. It is the difference between a story that has no ending and a story that, finally, however late and however painful, reaches one. She wrote down names. She trusted the world. She trusted someone who did not deserve it. And somewhere, in the record, in the evidence, in the fingerprints and the biological trace left on a rucksack left in a levee on the A40 on a December day in 1983, there may still be the information that closes this. 41 years have passed since a young Finnish woman with a rucksack and a diary stood on the side of a road in Oxfordshire and trusted a stranger with her safety. 41 years since someone tore pages from the diary and drove them away from the scene of what they had done, leaving a dead woman in the deep woodland of the Blenheim estate while the rest of the English countryside went about its August business entirely unaware. Cases like this accumulate a specific kind of weight over decades. They acquire layers, not just the original investigation, but the reopenings, the renewed appeals, the public fascinations, the books and the documentaries and the online threads where people piece together what is known and argue about what it means. The web sleuths threads on this case go back years. Reddit's r/unresolved mysteries has discussions that stretch across multiple threads and multiple years, with contributors who have done their own research, cross-referenced the geography, examined the Christopher Halliwell angle, and debated whether the two Chinner Hill murders are connected. The collective intelligence of people who care about unsolved cases has been applied to this one, repeatedly and with genuine effort. None of it has produced the name. Not yet. The Halliwell theory is worth one final assessment before this story moves toward its conclusion. What is the strongest version of the argument? Halliwell was 18 in August 1983. He was in the Swindon Wiltshire Oxfordshire orbit. The Blenheim estate is in Oxfordshire. The A40 runs through Oxfordshire. He told his cellmate, in 1985, that he had had sexual contact with a woman while strangling her, past tense, describing something he said he had done. He spent the rest of his life in the west of England. His confirmed murders used strangulation. His confirmed disposal sites were rural outdoor locations in Oxfordshire and Gloucestershire. A cache of 60+ items of women's clothing was found associated with his crimes. 2 confirmed victims. 60 items. The strongest version of the Halliwell theory is not that he can be proven to have killed Eila. It is that the probability that he killed more than 2 women is very high, that the geographic and temporal window of this case overlaps with his known territory and his stated history of violence, and that in the absence of any other named suspect, his name sits most naturally in the empty space where an answer should be. The weakest version is the obvious one: there is no evidence. He was 18. His first confirmed crime of violence was in 2003. To place him at Kingswood in 1983 requires an argument from pattern and probability rather than from fact, and pattern and probability are not evidence. Both of those things are true simultaneously. The argument for Halliwell and the argument against Halliwell occupy the same factual space and reach opposite conclusions from the same information. That is why this case remains open. That is why no charge has been brought and no arrest made. But consider the alternative. If it was not Halliwell, then who? The profile that emerges from the evidence, the controlled aftermath, the knowledge of rural Oxfordshire geography, the use of a main road levee for the rucksack disposal, the deliberate removal of diary pages, points to someone who was not acting for the first time and who was not acting without thought. A completely unknown perpetrator who committed a single act of violence in August 1983 and then never came to anyone's attention again, in any context, in 40 years, while managing all the evidence as competently as this person did, is not impossible. But it requires a set of assumptions that push against what investigators and criminologists know about how violence tends to work. People who plan. People who are organized. People who manage evidence deliberately over months. These are people who have, in general, a history that informs and enables that organization. Whether that history was known to police in 1983 or not is a different question. As Halliwell's own history demonstrates, someone can be known for lesser crimes without their potential for greater ones being identified. There is a final element of this case that does not receive enough attention, and it is this: the rucksack was left in a levee on the A40. The road Eila had been hitchhiking between Oxford and Witney. Weeks after her body was found. The news of the discovery of her body had been made public before the rucksack was found. Anyone in England who read a newspaper in late November 1983 might have seen a mention of the unidentified woman found in Kingswood. By the time she was identified and the news of her identity reached the press, the killer, whoever held that rucksack, knew that she had been found. Knew that police had a body and were investigating. And then, within 2 weeks of her identification, the rucksack appeared. That timing is not accidental. Something triggered the disposal of the rucksack in December 1983. The most obvious trigger is the news that she had been identified, that the investigation now had a name and a background and would begin looking outward from that name, trying to trace her movements. Someone who had her rucksack may have panicked or calculated that holding it any longer was more dangerous than leaving it somewhere it would be found. Or they may have wanted it found, for reasons that exist only in their psychology. Or they may have felt that returning it, incomplete, with the dangerous pages removed, was the best way to appear cooperative with an investigation while actually controlling what the investigation found. Returning the rucksack to the world. Keeping the pages. It is a statement of a kind. It says, here is what you can have. The rest is mine. Eila Karjalainen's family in Finland deserves to know who did this. After 41 years, that is not a platitude, it is a genuine moral claim that exists regardless of the passage of time. The failure to solve this case is not a historical curiosity. It is an ongoing injustice. A killer has lived their full life, or is living it still, in the freedom that Eila was denied at 23. Every year that passes without an answer is a year in which that imbalance persists. Modern forensic science offers the possibility of closing that imbalance. DNA technology is advancing rapidly. The genetic genealogy databases are growing year by year as more people submit their DNA for ancestry testing, which expands the pool against which crime scene DNA can be compared and from which family trees can be built. Even partial or degraded biological material, if it survives, can now yield more information than was imaginable in 1983 or even 2004. The threshold of what is possible keeps moving. Thames Valley police have never closed this case. It is cold, but it is open. And if you have any information, if you were on the A40 in early August 1983 and you gave someone a lift, or you saw something, or you know someone who talked in a way that has stayed with you, or yourself carry the weight of knowing something about what happened, the number to call is 101. The case can be referenced by Eila's name and the date of August 1983. Information is still being sought. Evidence is still being preserved. The investigation is still, formally and genuinely, alive. Eila came to England to see something of the world. She was the kind of person who wrote down the names of the people she met, because she thought they were worth remembering. She carried a diary and filled it with the texture of her journey, with the faces of strangers who gave her rides and pointed her in directions and made the world feel navigable and friendly and full of possibility. She was 23 and she was going home in a week. That person, the one with the rucksack and the diary and the plans and the career ahead and the family in Helsinki waiting to hear about the trip, deserves to have her story ended properly. Not in a lobby. Not in Woodland. Not in silence. In a name. In an answer. In the knowledge, finally, of what happened on the A40 on the 7th of August 1983. Somewhere, someone knows. A name was written in a diary. And then it was torn away. If this story moved you, and I believe it should, please share this video. Put it in front of more people. Cold cases like this one are sometimes broken by the simple fact of someone seeing something, hearing something, and making a connection they never made before. Eila's story being known by more people is not nothing. It is something. It might be the thing. Hit the like button. Leave a comment telling me what you think happened, and what detail in this story struck you hardest. Subscribe, because the next case we are examining carries the same kind of weight, an unsolved murder in which the evidence points close but never close enough, and in which the truth is still out there waiting to be found. For Eila. For her family. For the name on those torn pages. This story is not over.